Amen. You may be seated. As the younger ones of us are heading off to Children's Church, it's good to see you. My name is Michael. I'm a pastor here, and if you're in person, I can see you, so I like that part of church and being here. And the passage we talked about today in the quiet time. We have so many different gifts. It's hard to see them or impossible if you're not here in person. So I always want to invite you, if you're listening online, to attend in person. We miss out on some special blessings when that is the case. And maybe you're homebound, or maybe you've just been checking this out for a season, and that's okay too, and I'm glad that you're here as well. Reach out to us online, and we'd be glad to get connected with you. And so today, it's probably no surprise, spring is in the air. I could hear that from all the sniffling and the coughing and the rubbing of the eyes, seeing all that. I experienced that too, and I thought when we moved from Texas to Western New York that allergies would be not as big of a deal, but apparently they're just as big or more of a deal. At least that's what my doctor tells me. So, but yeah, we're a part of the season, and things are changing. It's good. It's warm, so I'm thankful for that. And no snow. Kind of over that for this season. Today we'll be in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. So you can grab your Bibles and turn there. We're in our series, The Real Me, in 23, and hopefully that helps you remember this, whether it's a year down the road or whenever, some of the things that we've talked about. The Real Me in 23, and today we'll be talking about grief. In all these topics and the things that we've been discussing, there may be some of those things that we maybe shy away from at times, or we would just say, you know what, that's uncomfortable, I don't want to talk about that. But the Bible's really clear on a lot of things, and it would be a shame for us to just kind of glance over those, or when it comes to the real issues of life, not address the things that are in the Bible. So the Bible's not a boring book. It's not a book that's uninformed. It's a book that can really help us with pretty much every aspect of life. And so that's why we turn to it. It's God's Word, and it's inspired. And so the phrase I want you to remember, it's a little bit longer this time. The end can be better than the beginning. The end can be better than the beginning. And this was written by someone who the Scripture considers, and God considers, the wisest man to have ever lived. And so if you read the account in 1 Kings chapter 3, we see how Solomon gained his wisdom. God came to him and asked him a question. What do you want? What do you desire? And Solomon said, I desire wisdom to lead your great people. And so God says to him, well, because you've asked for that, I'm going to give you that and more. And so when you look at the life of Solomon, you see, he comes after an amazing king, King David, his father, although David made a lot of mistakes. Solomon comes after him, and he gets the privilege of building the temple and really leading God's people into a season of wealth and prosperity and of great growth. And we knew that this was only going to last for a season because his son took over, Rehoboam, and kind of turned the ship towards a lack of wisdom. But this is kind of the peak of wisdom for God's people throughout all of time. And today we get to dial into this here in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And Solomon writes this towards the end of his life. If you kind of wonder why Ecclesiastes seems like maybe a book, you're like, I don't really like reading it because it makes me feel sad. That you're not alone. This is a book that Solomon writes from the perspective of all of his life experiences and deviating off the path to a degree from what God's original plan was for his life. And he says, there's all these things. When you read through this book, you'll see the word vanity. And there's all these things that, man, I tried. I did that to its nth degree. I tried it. I had all the money in the world that you could want. I had all the status, all the popularity. All the other kings were coming to me for advice. And all these things are vanity outside of knowing God. And when he points to that, he touches here in chapter 7 on grief. And how do we handle that? How do we process it? How do we deal with it? We don't just bury it under a rug. We don't just say, well, it's part of life, so rub some dirt in it, right? We've heard that before. Well, we need to deal with these things in our life, like grief, appropriately and rightly. And Solomon's going to give us some direction for that. And before we do that, I've asked many of you to share testimonies and videos on your experiences in life because, like a body with many members, we can all learn something from each other. And so today, I asked David to share, and so he did that over video form for us. You turn your attention to the screens, and then we'll get back into it.
My name is David Gray, and I'm a member of the Elba Baptist Church. And I would like to share with you about my struggles when I lost my wife, Esther Gray. We were married for 48 years. And this is the real me. I would like to share with you the struggles that I had. I was married, like I said, 48 years, and I lost my better half, and I just had trouble functioning, and I was in a daze like. And some of the struggles I had was I locked my keys in the trunk twice in 1 week, and I would forget where I was going, and I was just lost. It was during COVID time when everybody was isolated. We didn't have church services, and but the church family was with me and prayed for me and sent cards, and they were right there for me. And the Lord was comforting. He's our comforter, our time of sorrow, and I knew He loved me, and He gave Esther to me as a gift. I didn't own her. It was a gift from God, and it was meant to be temporary because nothing is permanent until we get to heaven. So 2 years after my wife passed, I felt the need to go to the grievance classes at Calvary Baptist Church on Vine Street in Elba. And it was a blessing to me because there's so many verses about lost loved ones. He loves us, and He's our comforter, and He's always with us, no matter what time of day. If we're in bed, if we're during the day, you're not alone. And so I would advise anybody to go to the classes. They're just wonderful. And Psalms has a lot to say about God's love, about being our comforter, and He's our strength in time of trouble. Hi, my name is David Gray, and I did find peace, and I got closer to God through hard times, as we all gone through hard times, and we do get closer to the Lord. And I just wanted to share my story with you, and thank you very much. And this is the real me.
Thank you, David, for sharing that. And we can all really learn something from each other, can't we? In the different stages of life and struggles that we go through in grief, we need each other, right? We've said at the beginning of the series, it's okay to not be okay, so stay there. And so wherever you're at, I don't know where you're at in this space right now, maybe even more recently, even the loss of a loved one, somebody close to you, a friend. And there's a place for you to come here and to find peace and to find that space where you might be able to grow, even in the midst of the struggle. And so maybe you're facing this, you have recently, you've experienced some of these emotions or feelings like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And those are actually 5 stages of grief. And wherever you feel like you're at right now, sometimes it's just hard to navigate that on your own. And so I'd like to invite you again, just, if you feel like maybe you're in that space, we go through this message, we close out today, reach out and maybe say, hey, I know I can't do this alone, but where do I start? And we can point you in the right direction. And so before we get into chapter 7, I want to read chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, because there's a time and a season for everything. You may have heard that somewhere, came from the Bible. And it says that in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, 1 and 2. It says, for everything there is a season, a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die. And so with that, we'll push into chapter 7. And first fill in the blank is grief's purpose. Grief's purpose. It exists to show us our brevity and our need for God. So when the scripture talks about life, we're talked about as these individuals that are valuable, that are loved by God, like David said. But at the same time, we're also discussed as like this dew on the grass. We're here in the morning, and then gone in the afternoon. And so the question is, well, what do we do with this perspective? Not that we should walk around being depressed all the time because of the brevity of life, but that this reminder of it should point us in this direction of doing something meaningful with our lives, pursuing God, belonging to Him, and then asking this question, while we're in the midst of grief, while we're here, what does God want me to learn? How does He want me to grow? And so verse 1 says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of birth. And so verse 1 really kind of points to a life well lived. When you read this at first glance, and really all through Ecclesiastes, you're like, Solomon, was it a bad day? It wasn't a bad day. In fact, Solomon, towards the end of his life, and I love this about our older saints. I won't say what old is, but when I talk with you, I get this perspective. I get this view that is larger than myself, because I look at life as a 34-year-old guy with little kids and just kind of like that phase of like the exhaustion of that. It's kind of hard to see past it. And then when I talk with you, like, here are these different stages, and here's what happens here, and here's what I'm thinking about. And I'm always like, wow, it's such like a vast perspective. But when you get to that point, especially if you've been pursuing God, you think about some things. And what I've gathered, at least, is similar to what Solomon said here in verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment in the day of death, better than the day of birth. So we have here the word for name in the Hebrew, shem. It means reputation. So when you see name, specifically here used this way, Solomon says, hey, there's a good reputation, and it's better than precious ointment in the day of death than the day of birth. And so we read that too, and we go like, wait a second, like, but it's joyous, like when a baby comes into the world, like, and I agree with you. I've been in the room where like my children have been born, and that's like the best day ever, right? You can be more joyful than in that moment. But there's something else that takes place when you lose somebody close to you. And maybe you've been in the room before, I know I have, when someone has passed away. And there's something that takes place, especially in the life of a believer. And it points us to this idea, this thought that it matters how we live, number one. And then number two, if you have lived a life well, if you pursued God, then there's something special about that, right? When someone passes away who we know has done that, we begin to think on everything that their life represented, right? This representation or this reputation of their life. And so I always think about that. And Christy and I have this conversation all the time. Growing up for me, like going to a church that there was a mass shooting at, and I was there, and then being in a bad car accident, and then getting cancer like all before 30, I think about death a lot. And some people go, that's morbid. You don't need to think about that, but life is short, right? No matter how much time you get. So when we read this passage, we want to go like, if tomorrow was the last day, what would people say about me, right? What would it say on my headstone? When people remembered me, what would they say? Right? I loved when we had Esther Johnson's memorial here. People just kept getting up. It's like, over and over again, people were saying things like, this person did, she did this for me, or she took the time to take me aside and read the Bible to me and be like, here's what it says. And do you really understand this? Just story after story after story, right? And when we read this, we shouldn't go, the day of birth is not a good day. But when we think about someone's life in its totality, for someone who followed God, that's a good day too. And in a lot of ways, it's a better day because we remember who they are and what they've done. And it challenges us too. Matthew Henry said this about verse 1. He said, a good name is better than all riches. He referenced Proverbs 21:1 here. And that is a name for wisdom and goodness with those who are wise and good. The memory of the just. This is good that will bring a more grateful pleasure to the mind and will give a man a larger opportunity of usefulness and will go forth and last longer than the most precious box of ointment. For Christ paid Mary for her ointment with a good name, a name in the Gospels, Matthew 26:13. And we are sure he always pays with advantage. So what more do we get? I mean, what more is more precious in life than a good name, right? And that's what we should be working towards in knowing God. And then verse 2, grief helps us think about using the time we have well. He says in verse 2, it is better to go to the house of mourning and in the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Well, wait a second. I mean, we're Baptists, so we're like, well, house of feasting. That's a good house, right? We like to do the meals together, and we have fellowship. And he's not saying it's not that it's not good, right? But he says it's better to go to the house of mourning. Now, why is this? Because Solomon, in all of his experience, everything that he's seen, he's had everything that you could have ever wanted, right? He tried everything. He's gotten all the popularity, all the money. He's had all the experiences that you could in life. And at the end, he says about pretty much everything about the book of Ecclesiastes. He makes a long list, and you can pretty much just say about everything in life, it was vanity outside of knowing God. And see, everything has purpose within knowing God. But he says here, it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind. This is to produce wisdom in us. If you were to ask a young person, I'm not knocking the young people in here, right? But if you were to ask a young person, maybe hasn't had any experience with death, or like a brush of death, or like their only experience was like I fell off my bike and that was scary. That's scary, but it's different, right? And so when we deal with real life-altering circumstances or life-changing circumstances, like Solomon did, he said it's better. It's more. It's better for you that you might think about the end, so that you will do what matters most right now. A lot of people, think to themselves when maybe they find themselves on that day, on that deathbed per se, there are all these things that I didn't do, or why didn't I do this, or why didn't I do that? And Solomon says, hey, if you would go to the house of mourning more than you go to the house of feasting and celebration and focusing on all the good and the happy things of life, right? And those aren't bad, he says, but he says if you would focus on this more, maybe this would change the way that you live, right? Evangelius of Pontius, he said this. I'm sure you've heard of this guy, right? Evangelius of Pontius. Anybody? No? Okay, all right, good. So he was a church father. He was actually a Christian monk who lived from 345 to 399 AD in the region of the Black Sea in Egypt. And he said this: the final end of human beings is a state of blessedness. If the Lord in the Gospels calls those who mourn blessed, blessed are those who mourn in Matthew 5:4, then Solomon quite rightly calls mourning the end of every human being, because those who live in a state of mourning are filled with an abundance of spiritual blessing. Now, it seems confusing for us, right? Like, wait, mourning, sadness, why would we want to stay in this place? In fact, we try to avoid the book of Ecclesiastes if all possible. Maybe you haven't read it all the way through. In fact, it's very hard to, because you get about halfway through and you're like, why am I doing this to myself? This makes me sad. But if you get to the end, all of life and the purpose that we have within it is surrounded with what God has for us, right? And if we can get to that point and go, okay, now I get it. Like, life is difficult, right? It is hard. That's why we talk about the body of Christ today. And I love that in that passage that Matt read, there towards the end of that chapter, it said if one person suffers, we all suffer, right? But we're a part of doing this together. And it's not about just like trying to like get through life and like grit your teeth and just like hide everything that's unpleasant, because of course when you look on social media, do you find anything bad, right? Or I mean, do you find anything like when you look at like people's families and like the pictures and like they're always having fun? I don't understand. Like nothing's ever wrong. Like they're never right? So because we put that picture of ourselves out there, so we like the good things. We like to think about that, the happy things, the family get-togethers, the meals. But Solomon says when we consider all of these things, you might want to go to the house of mourning more than you go to the house of feasting. And then he continues. So this is the second fill in the blank. Grief's instruction. Grief's instruction. And so this is the painful teacher, which can be the best teacher. I don't know if you had a teacher growing up that you didn't like very much. Maybe you knew of one that was like just really hard. You're like, why are they always on me? Like they're not as hard on the other students. And then you figured out like, at the end of the class or at the end of your time there in elementary school or junior high school, and you're like, wow, they were really like one of the best teachers I had. And it's often that just like grief, just like mourning, just like God uses this as a tool in our lives, we'll look back and think about in a similar way those teachers like, man, they were really hard. But it seems like the harder teachers are the ones that teach us the most, right? The ones who hold us accountable, right? The ones that hold our feet to the fire and go, I'm not just going to let you act like that, right? You need to act better. You need to learn. I know you're smarter than that, right? You've probably maybe heard that before. I know I have. And so grief's instruction here in verse 3, it says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. So in verse 3, we see that deep grief shows us what is important. Have you ever thought about that? Maybe someone close to you has passed away, or maybe you're dealing with like a health struggle or an illness, and you're just like, I just don't understand. Like, why would God want me to be in pain? Why would he want me to experience tears? Why would he really want me to be in grief? Why am I having to deal with this right now? And we look back to what Solomon said, and he says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. And this statement, it's almost like, wait, what is he talking about? Like, my heart is made glad. If I'm in grief, if I'm in mourning, then why would my heart be glad? Well, here it says sorrow. It's this word for it. It's the word kahus in Hebrew, vexation or grief. But then the word here for laughter, he says sorrow is better than laughter. Sakil in the Hebrew, he's talking about this hollow joy, this continuous, purposeless like mockery. You ever been around somebody that maybe it's just like sarcasm is the only language they speak? I'm not saying it's bad, all right? Because we're all like looking at each other like, that's you. That's you, right? So you listen to the pastor, okay? It's a bad thing. No, sarcasm has its place, right? But he says, like, why would you just always be in that place, right? Because then you don't take anything seriously in life. Like when something bad happens, you just make a joke out of it. Maybe a problem, right? Maybe to lighten the mood, we think. But Solomon said, hey, there's nothing really wrong here about contemplating mourning and grief. He says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. So when I started looking up the original translation of this, because when I see things that I'm like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English, like what does that really mean? I started looking at the Hebrew, and of course the word order is different in original languages. It always amazes me. And so the literal translation for this is, when a face is sad, a heart is happy. So wait a second. How do we define happiness for our hearts? Well, how do we grow in knowledge and wisdom of God? Most of the time it's in the difficult seasons of life, right? And it's when maybe things are not always going the way we want them to, or we're struggling, or we're like, God, help me understand what happens when we seek God out, right? Maybe not the times when times are good, and we're like, hey, things are good, God, let me know, when things are bad, I'll come back to you again. And when we do, he's like, you could be close to me all the time, right? You could be knowing me always. But when the fire gets lit, what do? You go, God, I need you, right? And there's this, this amazing growth in our lives, and we're like, what? I don't understand. And God's like, it's because you draw close to me whenever things aren't in your control, right? I love that because I'm type A, so I try to be in as much control as possible with pretty much everything in my life. But then I just have to keep going back to this place, like, but God, I made these plans, and he's like, yeah, you don't see the future. You don't know what that's going to be like, right? Just because you plan for things to be this way doesn't mean it's going to be that way. And that's not where you want to be anyway, right? Because you want to be where I want you to be. Sometimes he takes us to those places. So when a face is sad, a heart is happy, because a happy heart, one that knows God, one that's growing in knowledge and wisdom, is one that's experienced grief, loss, mourning, and is one that intentionally goes back to that place of like, what was I feeling when that was happening? And even now, maybe you're like, well, it's been a few years since I lost somebody important to me. You may go back to that place and be like, what did I feel? Like, what was God teaching me? And those are things that we should be reminded of. Like, do I need to be in the house of mourning? Yeah. More often in the house of laughter, because this is the greatest teacher. It's not the easy teacher, right? It's not the one that was like, you walked in the door and they were like, hey. You're like, yes. I don't have to work in that class. No, the class of life and the class that God gives us is a hard one, right? It's not easy. And he teaches us through the mourning. Some of us don't always understand, too, how we respond to grief. I remember when my grandmother passed away. My wife and I were serving in Gainesville, Texas, and my dad called me early in the morning. You always know when somebody calls you like at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Like, why are you calling me? Oh, it's probably not good, right? I remember answering the phone, and I got off, and I remember just like weeping after that. Now, she had Alzheimer's for like 10 years. And of course, she didn't know who I was anymore, and she was in a memory care facility in Michigan, and I hadn't seen her in a long time. But it's like sometimes the weight of that hits you, and you're just like, what is happening to me? Well, God's doing his work, right? In mourning, in grief, in loss. And so this is why Solomon points us in this direction, and why God really wants us to get down that it's okay to dwell in that space, right? It's okay to not be okay. Just don't stay there. But the question is, what is God going to teach you through that? Verse 4 says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It may say something different in your translation. Mine is ESV. So in verse 4, the wise person ponders death often. They think about, well, in light of the end, there's an end to everything, right? People always tell me, believers, they'll say, I hope Jesus comes back soon because, I don't want to get to that point. And that's okay too, right? It's okay to read your Bible and be like, I know he said he's coming back, but sooner would be better than later, right? I think we all feel the way to that, hopefully from time to time. But outside of that, Solomon, he knows. He's like, there's going to be an end. And for us, where do we find ourselves? Well, not being depressing all the time and going up to people, have you thought about your death recently? Right? And not like that, but Solomon goes, hey, it's okay to contemplate. It's okay to be in this house, what he calls. It's really like this box in our minds where instead of going, I don't want to think about that. In fact, when, I just kind of got over like 3 or 4 years ago from somebody else that I cared about, passing away, and I think I've moved past all those feelings, and so I'm good. Are you good? Okay? I don't know. I still think about those people who have followed God faithfully in my life, and you know what? Those people and their memory taught me more than anything else, right? And then as I experience those situations, those difficulties, as I progress in life, I'm like, how did they handle that? Because when I'm in the house of mourning, and when I think about these things, I grow in wisdom, right? I grow in understanding of God. And so he says here, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Shakespeare, he talked about death in this way. He said, why? What should be the fear? I do not set my life at a pen's fee. And if you don't know where that came from, it came from Hamlet. And what it says here about this quote, it says, is there such a thing as fear if you don't fear death? In Hamlet, the prince wonders if real danger can exist without fear because he doesn't fear death. There is no such thing as danger. Now, it's okay to think about that and then, and fear, or think about that day like, oh, I'm kind of worried about that. I was visiting with a young lady at the church we were at before. She wanted to get baptized, and we didn't have a children's pastor at the time, so I met with the family, and she looks at me and she goes, we were talking about baptism. She's like, Pastor Michael, there's something I need to talk to you about. She says, I'm afraid of death. And, the parents were like, no, don't talk about that. That's not the right time. It's not the right place to do this. I said, it's okay. And you know what? It's okay to be afraid, to think about those things. And I in this 8-year-old girl, I saw this perspective like, I don't know very many 8-year-olds who are like, I'm afraid of death. But for her, she was like, this is very real. Like, I'm like contemplating real things. I said, this is good. This is, we should think about this. And so if that's the case, and how do you want to live right now? She's like, well, I know I need to get baptized. I know I need to make things right with God like right now. And so what else do I need to do? She was very eager. She's like, I'm thinking about these things. And so maybe for some of us, we need to dwell on this a little bit more, right? It's not that we fear the end, right? Because the end is just the beginning for us as believers. We enter into heaven, but it's okay to live with this healthy reverence for knowing that it could be tomorrow, or it could be 30, 40 years from now. And you know what? It doesn't really matter which of those happens, because that shouldn't change how we're going to live. We shouldn't go like, you know what? I've probably got 30. So I'm going to spend the next 10 kind of doing my thing. And then I'll get a little bit more serious and a little bit more serious towards the end. And then what's the point, right? If we're thinking about these things, then it should be different for us as believers. So just the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's this word in Hebrew, simcha. It means this glad result or happy issue. Solomon goes, there's a time and a place for everything, right? There's plenty of time for all those things. There's plenty of time for the birthday parties and the good, get-togethers and the feasting and all those things we would put in the category of good and enjoyable experiences in life, and we should celebrate those and remember those in a good way. But here he says, the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And this phrase here is used in the Hebrew and in the Bible specifically to point to this fixation, this house of mirth, this fixation on only good and enjoyable things. If I would put it maybe in our perspective or our context or our culture, it would be only thinking about those Facebook moments. Only thinking about the perfect family picture and all like the heartache that it took. Smile right now. If you don't smile, then, right? Because we've all done that before, sometimes weekly, just get the good picture because the rest of the week has been not so good. But if at least I can have this picture, then I can think about happy things, right? And it's not that we can't enjoy that, but Solomon is saying, he goes, you know how real life is, right? We all struggle. And in fact, maybe more of the time than not, we're spending our time focusing on spaces and places that would not actually take up the percentage of our thoughts, right? Or maybe we just try to distract ourselves. Solomon points to this as well, and he goes, maybe you just want to be in the house of mirth. He's like, try that your whole life and see how it works out. You're not really going to grow in wisdom. In fact, you're going to try to pursue all things that make you happy for a moment, and your heart is really not going to be happy, right? Be in the place or in the house of mourning, have a happy heart, right? Because it's filled with wisdom. Here's the third fill in the blank, grief's timing. Grief's timing. Is grief ever good timing for anybody, by the way? Yeah, no, it doesn't ever seem like that, right? So grief's timing, it never really seems like there's a good time for grief. We'll say like, you know what, I'll deal with that later, right? I know this just happened, but I've got to be there for everybody, and like I got to be strong, and I just can't really handle grief right now. It doesn't come when we always want it. So in verse 5, it says, it is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. So in verse 5, we see that the teaching we need doesn't always come when we want it, right? Just the teacher who's like challenging you, they come at the point when you want it, you're like, I know I have to study for the test, but I don't want to. I want to go out with my friends. I know I need to start writing that paper now so it's ready in 3 weeks. It's supposed to be due. I'm filled with a lot of some of that anxiety from the past, growing up as a kid and like, I got to get my work done. And right now as I'm in the season of working on my doctorate, because they're like, yeah, you don't play games. Start writing your paper a month ahead, or just don't even bother because you're going to fail, right? And so this teacher, many of the teachers that I've had recently have been like, you need to get serious about it. And I'm telling you that because I care about you. I want you to be successful. I want you to come to the end of this and have it be a good experience for you. And I go like, okay, it may not be what I want to hear right now, but I know it's what I need to hear. And so that's why he says here, it's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. So Solomon's speaking to what he's already said here in the first 4 verses. Sometimes people need to hear that they need to deal with something or process grief, and maybe you need to be that person in somebody's life. Maybe it's not you that are presently dealing with that, but you see the effects of delaying dealing with grief, or delaying being in the house of mourning, or just always focusing and fixating on like the Facebook moment. And you see people in your life, maybe it's a spouse or a child or even a parent, and you have to go like, we need to deal with reality. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to talk about what makes us grieve or what makes us mourn, because as we do that, right, we're going to grow. Our heart's going to become happy because they're going to be wise hearts. But at the same time, God goes, if you don't deal with this now, right, if you don't say you're not okay right now, what's going to happen? It's just going to blow up down the road. So you're not only not going to become wise, but then you're also going to set yourself up for destruction and hurting other people. Solomon's like, deal with it, right? Be in the house of mourning. That's okay. If you're having a bad day or if something has happened, it's okay to mourn. And then in verse 6, it says, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This is also vanity. And this is really the first, it's the only time he'll use it in this passage, vanity, but he uses it throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. So don't waste the time you have on things that don't matter, right? It's kind of like waiting for the pot to boil. You're like, it's going to happen right now. And when I'm getting, the few things that I can cook, I get the box mac and cheese, right? And I'm like heating up the water, and milk and all that stuff, like, boil. Does it ever happen when you're just like staring at it, right? Or does it happen when you're like, hold on, I'm going to go take care of something else, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's boiling over, right? And so he says, why are you going to spend all your time staring at that? You're waiting on the pot. It's crackling, it's boiling under that wood. That's how they used to cook things, right? So they're on the stovetop. And he says, so is the laughter of fools. This is also vanity. What's one of our defense mechanisms, right? When grief comes, when mourning comes, when like God reminds us of something that we need to deal with that's maybe not going to be fun, he goes, don't worry, Satan will come in and whisper in our ear, okay, don't focus on that, right? Don't worry about that right now. And then we're only hurting ourselves more when we say, you know what, I don't want to deal with that And what happens? Do we say like, hey, you know what? There will be a better time for it. I'm thinking like, oh, hold on, I'm going to schedule grief and mourning in. I've got this spot in like 3 months, and honestly, things have been a little bit busy right now. So when we get to that point, don't worry, I penciled you in. And so I really am going to think about this grief. I really am going to think about mourning. And Solomon's like, be in the house of mourning more than you are in the house of mirth, right? More than you are in the house of the Facebook moment. It's not that there's not a place for those things, right? But how does God grow us? How does He give us a happy heart, a wise heart? When we think about life, when we think about the real struggles of life. And here's the last thing, grief's end. You know, there's an end to everything, even our physical existence here on earth. And luckily, God has made us in a way, because He loves us and cares about us, that we're these multi-dimensional, multifaceted beings. Just like the family of God, we have different parts. We have a soul that can belong to God. It can be with Him forever in heaven if we would acknowledge who He is. If we said, hey, you know what? I admit I'm a sinner. I believe that Jesus sent God's Son to die on the cross for my sins. And He raised from the dead. We just celebrate that last week. Easter, right? It's hard, you know. We're like, you know, thanks after Easter, message on mourning, grief. That's really good. But God wouldn't give us these words. He wouldn't give us a whole book where an older guy sat down at the end of his life and said, here's what you should really think about. Not just at the end, but throughout life. So in verse 7, it says, surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. So verse 7 kind of points us to this. Don't be like the world. It's not worth it. Don't waste your time. Sometimes the temptation, especially as maybe we feel like enough grief or enough mourning, we're like, okay, God, my heart is happy enough, actually. So if I didn't have to experience any more grief in life, any more difficulty, I'd be okay with that, right? My heart is good. It's happy enough. Please don't bring any more struggle or difficulty my way. But is that how it works, right? We're like, it's not the right time. You know what? And or I'm not ready for the end. Or maybe I'm just not ready to deal with life's difficult circumstances, where everything ends, and even in the grief, we can learn and we go. So surely oppression drives the wise into madness. There are things that, while Solomon says, hey, you know, it's good to focus on mourning. Don't let it drive you crazy, right? Don't be like, why is everything going wrong? Like, why do people die? Why? There was a song that was written about that recently. Why? Why does this happen? Why does that happen this way? It's okay to ask the why questions. We had a series on that last year. But it's not okay to go like, God, you're not in control. You don't understand. You don't know what's happening here. And He goes, no, actually I do. And I brought you to this place for a reason, right? And we all make choices. And Matt talked about that at the beginning. We make choices for the good or the bad. We can choose to do right things or evil things. And those do affect us too. But there's one thing that whether or not you choose to follow God or not, we're all going to experience grief. We're all going to experience this mourning, this difficulty in life. And Solomon says, hey, don't give up, right? He says, surely oppression drives the wise into madness. Those of you who have been pursuing this, who've spent more time in mourning than in the house of mirth, he says that sometimes the madness of life and the difficulty of struggle, if you fixate on it too much, if you don't have those moments where you get away and you celebrate, then it can drive you into madness. And he says, and a bribe corrupts the heart. So He's working on us, and God is on these hearts of wisdom that are acquired through contemplation over the end and mourning and life, and getting to that point. Then He says here, and a bribe corrupts the heart. He's like, don't give it all away, right? You know, we can focus and you can deal with all these things, but then maybe towards the end you can deviate, right? And maybe we've known somebody who's done that before, and saying you're doing really well, you've been following God, and maybe a circumstance pops up and you're like, I just can't handle it anymore. Like, God doesn't love me. And you just say, I'm done. And Solomon's like, don't do this either. A bribe corrupts the heart. You know, don't get off the wise path. And then here to close it out in verse 8, it says, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. So in verse 8, you see that in the end, you can see the whole story, right? Have you ever wondered, like, being in the room, and I've been in the room, and it's not a room that is without tears, right? I'm not saying that the room of grief and the room in the house of mourning is a place where you don't shed tears. That is the place where you do that, right? But do you want to be in the place where you never shed any tears? You want to be in the place where you never think about the end, where you never think about the reasons that maybe life would cause us to mourn and to struggle? Well, no. He says here, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. Have you ever picked up a book and you're like, you know what? I really want to know how this ends. So I'm going to read the end first so that I know, because the rest of the book will be better, right? Does it ever happen? And then you read the end and you're like, why did I do that? And you read the rest of the book without the enjoyment of anticipating how the story's going to end, right? So in the same way, God says, hey, I know the end, right? I know you don't. But life's a journey that he gives to us. And as Solomon experienced it almost in its entirety up until this point in his life, he said, here's some things that grief can do in our lives. And God uses that as a tool, right? He's taken the tool out of the toolbox and he goes, here's one of the biggest tools that I have to use in your life. Grief, mourning, difficulty. Right? And we don't like to think about it like that. I'd like to use the tool of always feeling great about everything, of always being happy and having health and having never, nobody in my life ever struggling, nobody in my life passing away. Well, that's not reality, right? And so as we deal with reality, God pulls out one of the greatest tools, grief. And what does he use it for? Well, he uses it for a purpose, right? To teach us, to give us instruction, and its timing may not feel like it's the right timing to us, but it's always the right timing. It's always when we need it. And it's maybe when we need a course correction, we're about to make a bad choice, and God says, grief, mourning. That's what you need right now, for me to refine you. It'd always be nice if we didn't have to, God, I want you to refine me, but please don't use fire. He doesn't do that with the elements that he's given us in the world, right? How do we get the silver? We pull the dross off of it. By the way, I'm going to have to heat it up to like 1,000 degrees every time. It's going to happen over and over again, right? Is that what we desire in the moment? No, right? But as we look back and in the moment, as we're able to go, okay, I know God is allowing this for a reason, right? Not always so we can like stand up and be like, I'm so happy about this. But it's okay to take joy in the morning while it's taking place. And in the end as well. So he says, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit better than the proud in spirit. So the word here for end is a krieth in the Hebrew. And it's used throughout the Old Testament. Is when it talks about an end, it's talking about this beautiful picture of like a tapestry. Right? Have you ever thought about that? Like when you see the end, you see an artist who's completed something, and I'm not artistic at all. So if I tried to do that, it would not end well, right? But if you see an artist who's been given that gift by God, and they get to the end of the picture, and you're watching them paint, you're like, I see what it's going to be like. And then it's finally done, and you're like, oh, now I get it, right? Do we have that perspective in the middle? Maybe not the full perspective, but maybe part of it. And Solomon's saying, he's like, if you want to have a happy heart, if you want to allow grief and mourning to do its work rightly in your life, you want to have that happy heart and say, God, I'm not in control, right? I have some choice here, but I'm not in control of what the end of this is going to look like. So give me that perspective. And I'll close with this. So I was flying into Dallas-Fort Worth about 2.5 years ago. My grandfather was on his deathbed. And that same day, I'm leaving the house to get on a plane. My mom calls me and tells me that my dad has had a heart attack on Thanksgiving Day. And he's going to the hospital by ambulance. And so there's a lot of things that were happening for me during that time, mourning and grief. But I remember getting there and being with my grandfather and holding his hand. And he couldn't talk, but he was smiling. And the look in his eyes said enough. And I remember giving him a hug and just, and talking to him about life and everything that had taken place up to that point. And I remember hugging him for the last time and walking out, and I was sad, right? As we all would be, and walking out. But I also felt like this overwhelming like gift that God had given. And just thinking about life and mourning, like, how much has God taught me through this individual? But I didn't realize how much he was going to teach me after he was gone. As I thought about this, like what the beginning of the passage says, you want to have a good name? You want to have a good reputation? Solomon says it's going to be tied up in being in the house of mourning. And when that happens, going, okay, I get it. I understand what you're doing, and I trust you, even when maybe we don't understand it totally. So what does he want us to do? Well, have patience in that. The word here for patience is the word for long-suffering, used many, many times throughout the Hebrew text. And he's teaching us so much I don't know if you don't know, it's okay. Send an email this week too. We've been dealing with some more health things with Christy's stuff. We don't know exactly what's going on. We got more doctor's appointments this week, and we had somebody had gifted us something, a concert, and we kind of thought, I don't know if this is the right timing. We're like, maybe we should just not do it. But we've been blessed with that, and we had the babysitting and all that stuff set up, which is a gift if you're a young parent. And we went to this concert, Phil Wickham concert. It was his sing-along tour. And I was like, I don't know how much singing along we're actually going to be able to do, so why would we go? But we went, we kind of found a spot, in the back, and we sat and just put my arm around her, and we just enjoyed being there and got a great blessing from it. Just, if you can, we haven't been in the room a lot, recently, with thousands of other people singing songs about God. And I thought, if this is like kind of what the end is like, we're ushered into eternity, and we hear the songs of the angels and of the saints singing together, then maybe this would give us a little bit better perspective too, right? While we're in the midst of mourning, a lot of the time, probably more than the Facebook moments, God still gives us these moments, even in the midst of the difficulty, to go, okay, God, I may not totally understand it right now, but I trust you, right? He's teaching us, and we want to have that happy heart. Grief's got a purpose. God teaches us. It may not always be the perfect timing, but there'll be an end to it, right? Be an end to this mourning, this difficulty, the Bible tells us, but we'll be in perfect fellowship with God again, right? So what are we going to learn right now? I don't know. Hopefully, like what Solomon said, be in the house of mourning and not in the house of mirth as much as you possibly can, and enjoy the life that God has given. One more thought. Somebody said to me this week, in the perspective of, things go more badly or things go good, and this in the perspective of eternity in heaven, said, if I go, I win. If I stay, I win. So what a great perspective. God, He's teaching us right now if we'd let Him. It's not always the way that we'd like it to be or we'd want it to be in regards to how He teaches us. But if we're here, we win, right? Let's have a better perspective. If we go, we win too, all right? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time, for the Word, God, for Ecclesiastes, and it teaches us so much, sometimes painfully, but God, we know that this tool, this instrument, is sometimes the best one, the one that's the biggest in your toolbox. God, while we walk through the midst of grief, I pray that you give us this ability to see the purpose in the midst of it. God, that you continue to teach us, help us to trust you, knowing that our timing's not your timing, and that we need a clear and fresh perspective on that. And the grief does end. God, there'll be a time we will sit before you in heaven all together, and we'll be singing with the rest of the saints. And just to help us remember, God, if we go, we win. If we stay, we win. Help us to have that perspective on life, and as we do this together. In your name we pray. Amen.